Before we begin, I'd like to thank everyone for bearing with me with these last two videos. I know the audio quality has been a bit precarious, and that's because I'm dealing with some things behind the scenes, but we've got a lot of amazing content planned for you, so just please stay tuned. Thank you so much. Enjoy the video. If you happen to have even an elementary level of knowledge regarding the First World War, you're probably already well aware of the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was a strategy meant to deliver a quick and decisive victory for the Germans at the outbreak of the First World War. Conceived by German Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen, the plan aimed to avoid a prolonged two-front war on Germany's western and eastern borders by swiftly defeating France. To do this, German forces would enact a sweeping maneuver through Belgium and then turn to face Russia in the east. At first glance, the plan seemed elegant and ruthless in its simplicity. However, in actuality, it was fundamentally flawed and ultimately unworkable, leading to some of the failures Germany saw in the early stages of the war. Schlieffen's vision was largely shaped by his experiences as a staff officer rather than a battlefield commander, which influenced his reliance on rail timetables, meticulous planning, and abstract theoretical exercises. But his grand design made dangerously optimistic assumptions about logistics, troop movements, and enemy resources. This optimism came to be the plan's most critical detractor. Moving a massive, country-spanning army is no easy task. Each one of the German corps set to take part in the maneuver consisted of 40,000 men and 12,000 horses, and required immense amounts of food, ammunition, and supplies. Schlieffen expected the army to march 25 to 32 kilometers a day, a rate calculated during peacetime drills without accounting for enemy resistance, poor road conditions, or the logistics of moving vast numbers of men and equipment. This was, in itself, a logistical nightmare, but it actually gets worse for the Germans. The plan also assumed German engineers could quickly seize and repair Belgian railways. But the Belgians had effectively decimated all of their rail infrastructure as soon as Germany stepped foot in the country, forcing the Germans to rebuild entire sections of rail line just for this plan to even be viable. As you might infer, these troubles slowed the advance significantly, leaving German troops undersupplied and exhausted before they'd even reached France. Schlieffen's plan relied essentially on the perfect execution of these movements to a T. Suffice it to say, such a calculation was incredibly optimistic. By the time German forces approached the Marne River, they were already behind schedule, exhausted, and struggling with severe shortages of food and ammo. And as if all that wasn't enough, Germany had underestimated how fast the French and Russians could mobilize. Both France and the Russian Empire had learned valuable lessons from previous conflicts, mostly their wars with the Kingdom of Prussia, the precursor state to the German Empire, and had significantly improved their railway networks and mobilization strategies. The French, in particular, were able to rapidly deploy troops to the front lines using their extensive rail system, and even commandeered Parisian taxis to rush reinforcements to the Marne. In the east, the Russians launched their offensive into the region of East Prussia much sooner than the Germans had anticipated, forcing Germany to divert forces from the Western Front to stabilize the situation. And the Germans simply disregarded the British in their plan, assuming they'd never uphold their treaty with Belgium. But, of course, the British Expeditionary Force did mobilize to assist the French and Belgians, partially motivated by historical conflicts with Germany. The Anglo-German naval arms race was still in full swing, and the Moroccan crises both had pitted Britain and Germany against each other in the years leading up to the war. So all that being said, the Schlieffen Plan was effectively one of the best examples of poor planning we have in history. The Germans based their entire offensive gambit on an overly optimistic assessment of their enemies and of the setbacks in their way, and failed to create contingencies if any of their assumptions turned out to be false. They knew that the Entente powers had the upper hand in resources and manpower, and a prolonged war would inevitably bleed Germany dry. The Schlieffen gamble was therefore born out of necessity, an attempt to knock out the enemy before they could fully mobilize. But in the end, it was simply destined to fail. Even if the Germans had won the initial battles, their forces were overextended, under-resourced, and unable to sustain the momentum necessary for a quick victory. The exact extent to which the Schlieffen Plan was rigidly followed is still contested, but what remains clear is that it symbolizes this flawed German belief in a swift, decisive victory that never came. The Battle of the Marne marked the end of that illusion, and with it, this cautionary tale was born. But what if that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Schlieffen Plan somehow actually worked? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help contribute to these scenarios, or just have ideas you'd like to have made into videos, consider becoming a channel member or supporting us on Patreon. Thanks, and enjoy the video. We know the First World War to be a long and grueling conflict that truly exposed the world to the horrors of modern warfare. War was not glorious. It was not a means to national pride or personal greatness. It was a terrifying bloodbath that swallowed up the young men of 2 continents and left swaths of land charred and devastated. But perhaps this devastation could be avoided. If we presume that somehow the Schlieffen Plan had succeeded, and the German High Command's bold and irrational assumptions somehow proved to be true, even in spite of everything going against this, the Great War would actually unfold not as a protracted and grinding conflict, but as a rapid, decisive campaign that lasts just 2 months. The massive wing-shaped sweep through Belgium and northern France, assuming it works, would crush the French, Belgian, and British forces in a lightning-quick offensive. By early October 1914, Paris would have fallen, and France, shocked and battered, would have sued for peace. The Great War, as history remembers it, would become the Lightning War, or the Blitzkrieg. Germany, Austria, Britain, Belgium, and France would draw up a treaty dictating the outcome of the war in the West. In our own history, France imposed very harsh, very humiliating terms of peace against Germany in the First World War. France had felt the brunt of the war in the West, with the majority of the fighting occurring in and devastating French territory. French revanchists also felt that it was an opportunity to get back at Germany for the Franco-Prussian War, and that imposing the harshest possible terms on Germany was a matter of French survival. France forced Germany to accept blame for the war, mind you, a war which started over the assassination of an Austrian archduke by a Bosnian Serb, which pulled the Russian Empire, which then caused Germany to join to defend Austria. So the French terms were clearly motivated by a sense of revenge. Furthermore, France imposed incredible economic penalties on Germany and forced them to completely demilitarize. This much was motivated by the devastation the war caused to France's economy, requiring a supplemental source of income to keep even the victors' economies afloat. It was also a means to prevent a repeat scenario and secure quote-unquote lasting peace for Europe. Well, needless to say, the lasting peace didn't last much at all, and the harsh terms imposed on Germany only fueled the rise of National Socialism, which of course led to the Second World War. But in this alternate timeline, Germany would have suffered a mere fraction of the casualties compared to the French in our own history. They also would not feel the same sense of humiliation, nor would they see a need to prevent widespread devastation that they never bore witness to. Instead, the armistice signed between Germany and the defeated Western Allies would be far less punitive than the Treaty of Versailles. Germany would focus on dismantling French military power. The treaty would enforce likely a significant reduction of the French peacetime army and a demolition of any border fortifications that define the Franco-German boundary. We'd also see, just as the French had imposed on the Germans in our timeline, a demilitarized buffer zone, perhaps even also some buffer states in between, maybe a Wallonia or a Greater Luxembourg of sorts, although these are less realistic, all designed essentially to keep France just weak enough to not threaten Germany in the foreseeable future. The British public would find the war a disappointment, but having been spared any incredible devastation, the British Empire would simply find it reasonable to retreat to its role as the world's leading naval power, and focus its attention on its vast colonial holdings in Africa, India, and elsewhere, which remained intact. The British economy, too, remained intact, with no crippling war debts and its manpower largely preserved. Additionally, with France incapacitated, Russia and Serbia would find themselves isolated, and in Russia's case, greatly overextended. The psychological blow of France's collapse and the swift, successful blitz of German forces into the West would compel Russia to sue for peace. This would leave Serbia completely helpless, as the Austrians and Germans would move in and end the conflict by December. In the ensuing treaties, Serbia would be demilitarized and forced to pay significant war reparations to Austria. Additionally, the Baltics would likely be granted independence, and Poland, too, would come under German oversight. But there would be no grand annexations, no incredible, extraordinary redrawing of the map of Europe. Instead, Germany's vision would be to stabilize Europe under her economic and military influence, creating a new status quo rather than redrawing the map entirely. A status quo built not around Paris, but Berlin. Given the relatively quick end to the war, Austria-Hungary, having subdued Serbia and solidifying its variable hegemony over the Balkans, now faces less of an existential threat. They would focus on rooting out extremist groups in the Balkans wherever possible. While it's true that the Austro-Hungarian Empire would still have to deal with internal ethnic divisions and political turmoil, without the strain of a long, drawn-out war, Austria-Hungary still has time to grapple with the issues facing it. The Habsburg Empire would lumber on, but would require a stabilizing force in power to prevent its collapse. The United States, too, untouched by the conflict, would likely remain in the same pre-war state of isolationism. Without the economic boom provided by war contracts and post-war reconstruction, the United States isn't immediately the same global financial powerhouse, but that doesn't mean the United States isn't an important global power. The US would serve as a market and a supplier for Europe, which would inevitably serve to further enrich the British, who had an internal market in the form of India, but required a stable external market like America and Germany to uphold their superpower status. That being said, the US still does look a bit different in this timeline. The Roaring Twenties, if they occur at all, do not reach the heights of exuberance seen in our timeline, and furthermore, the lack of excruciating war debts on major world powers means we don't see a Great Depression either, which makes the rise of extremist groups in Europe and abroad a bit less likely. And it also means the USA continues to grow economically without a boom and bust cycle. The 1916 election, unfolding in a nation that has largely sidestepped any global turmoil and also has not bore witness to the devastation of modern warfare in the form of the Great War, would end up being a contest between two of the leading figures of the progressive era. Woodrow Wilson, running for re-election, is going to face strong competition from Republican Charles Evans Hughes, who had been a critic of Wilson's cautious foreign policy with regard to the Western Hemisphere, and was an advocate of a far more assertive American stance. We'd likely see Hughes win by a slim margin, perhaps carrying the state of California, which was contested by, I believe, under 3,000 votes in our own history. America's focus under Hughes would turn resolutely towards its own backyard, Central and South America. Hughes was not an interventionist abroad in the sense that he wished to intervene in European and East Asian political affairs, but he was an interventionist within the Americas, believing the Monroe Doctrine to be the supreme law of American foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine would, of course, be reinvigorated under Hughes' presidency, and under the guise of promoting stability and democracy, the United States would intensify its involvement in the affairs of its southern neighbors. Hughes would probably intervene in Venezuela to secure its oil reserves and topple the dictatorship in the country, imposing a democratic regime in Venezuela, and perhaps doing the same for Colombia in an attempt to secure the Caribbean as a veritable American lake. So without this impetus to assume a leading global role, the United States is focused on its political and economic dependencies in Central and South America. Given a relatively secure and stable United States, this also opens the door for America to focus more on expanding its influence in East Asia, perhaps developing the Philippines or intervening in China within the next few years and next few presidencies. Moving on to the Middle East, we have a much less stable situation. In this alternate timeline, since the Ottoman Empire didn't really involve itself in the Great War, the internal strife, economic stagnation, and rising nationalist sentiments among its subjects are going to continue to push the empire into a spiral of national sickness. The Young Turk movement, or something akin to it, might take power earlier, inciting a revolution and destabilizing the region. As the Ottomans stumbled due to this unrest, the Arabian Peninsula would likely become a flashpoint for conflicts and new opportunities. Figures like T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, might still find their place in history as champions of Arab nationalism, especially if the British still find it necessary to intervene in order to protect their interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. With the Ottomans too weak to maintain their grip on the region, Arab leaders like Sharif Hussein of Mecca would have seized the moment, declaring independence and waging guerrilla warfare against the remnants of Ottoman authority. If the Ottoman Empire breaks apart, this is going to be an opportunity for the British, the Russians, the Arabs, and any other groups of interest in order to propel their own agendas. Nationalist revolutions are going to flare up, from Damascus to Mecca to Baghdad, and new lines will be quite literally drawn in the sand. Of course, in Europe, things are much more stable. Germany is now the dominant power on the continent. The Germans would begin to turn their attention towards securing their long-term interests through economic rather than purely military means. The German Empire's vision centers around the creation of something of a mark zone, an economic sphere of influence stretching across Central and Western Europe, tied together by German financial clout and industrial supremacy. This zone, with the German mark as its anchor currency, would integrate the economies of conquered and allied nations into a cohesive system that not only strengthens Germany's economic position, but also serves as a powerful deterrent against future conflict. Keep in mind that ever since 1871, if it had been in the best interests of Germany to go to war with France and destroy France as a concept, then Germany would have attacked France before it could even concoct an alliance with Russia in 1894. This pragmatic German approach to France is driven by a clear understanding of the past instead of revenge. Rather than subjugating France to the point of economic ruin, which would only foster resentment and a thirst for revenge, Germany aims to entwine the French economy with its own, making France dependent on German markets, investments, and trade networks, and ensuring that any future war with Germany would be economically disastrous for the French. Now, on the other hand, Germany's plans for its economic sphere would deliberately exclude Russia, whose vast yet mismanaged empire is too unstable and unreliable to be integrated into the mark zone. Russia, burdened by the Tsar's continued mismanagement, would continue to inch toward an impending disaster. The autocracy, already weakened by the failures of the Russo-Japanese War and the 1905 revolution, are going to continue to lose the confidence of the people and even factions within the Russian government. It's likely that another revolution like 1905 would break out, but the result of this revolution is less easy to determine. Germany would certainly insert itself into the playing field, but Berlin's support would undoubtedly fall behind conservative factions. Germany would not be in support of a Republican, or worse, a nationalist government in Russia. Perhaps then, the Germans go about installing a new form of monarchy in the fractured Russian Empire, maybe under a figure like Nikolai Nikolaevich. We actually explore a similar scenario in our last video about if the Willy Nicky telegrams succeeded, which you can watch by clicking on our profile. Now, regardless of who ends up being at the helm of this new government in Russia, the new Russian establishment would be considerably subservient to Germany, though perhaps still function outside of the mark zone. This new Russia, though, even if it is more efficient and less corrupt than the Tsarist regime, would remain a splintered, vulnerable state, struggling to find its footing. For Germany, the aim is, and always has been, to keep Russia contained, pliable, and preferably aligned against any potential resurgence of French or British influence. As the years unfold and Germany continues to consolidate its economic hold over Europe, France, though economically tied to Germany and reliant on its markets, would be simmering with an undercurrent of anger and discontent. People like Charles de Gaulle and André Maginot, symbols of a resurgent French nationalism, begin to represent a reviving desire to reclaim France's lost honor and independence. In the streets of Paris and other major cities, the rhetoric of revanchism will return, perhaps in a similar fashion to that seen in Italy during the interwar period in our own history. This new political revolution would envelop France in a fervor echoing the spirit and aesthetic of 1802 and 1851. Nationalist movements would gain traction, calling for a new revolution to rid the nation of what is perceived as German economic imperialism. These anti-German factions are a volatile mix of conservatives, Republicans, and radicals. However, the threat of another war with Germany, which likely would end in a swift blitz of France not unlike the previous one, keeps these factions from outright revolt. Without the catastrophic upheavals of a drawn-out Great War, radical ideologies like fascism and communism will probably fail to gain the same foothold, and they will also not have opportunities to carve their names into the history books as they had in Italy or Spain early on. Now, the brewing conflict in Europe would be less ideological and more economic, seeing a new kind of rivalry take shape and pit Germany's continental system against the global reach of Britain's imperial network, with the undertone of this French nationalist movement for economic independence. Throughout this time, we might assume the German and British systems, while fundamentally different, had become interdependent in much the same way that the United States and China are in our own day and age. Germany's industrial might and Britain's access to global resources would have formed a mutually beneficial, albeit tense, relationship. Trade is flowing between the two spheres, fueling economic growth on both sides and massive consumer markets, but still underlying this cooperation is a deep-seated competition for dominance, with both powers engaging in a constant tug-of-war to gain the upper hand. Now, besides Europe and the Americas, the power balance in East Asia would also shift as a result of the changes made in this scenario. In the power vacuum left by Russia's weakened state, Japan is going to seize the opportunity and expand its empire across East Asia. Japan will also be emboldened by the British, and will extend their influence over Korea, Manchuria, and the Chinese coastline. China, meanwhile, will continue to struggle to maintain its sovereignty amid the growing influence of Japan and the internal divisions that threaten to tear the nation apart. The Republic of China, which had been established in 1912 following the fall of the Qing dynasty, has been facing continuous pressure from warlords and nationalist factions throughout this entire post-war period. However, without the chaotic effects of World War I spilling into the region, the ROC will probably have managed to cling to power, albeit precariously. Japan's expansionist ambitions and Britain's strategic realignment would have created a fragile balancing act in China, as the Germans too would throw their hat into the ring and try to carve out a sphere of influence in China for themselves. Clearly, the powers that be are beginning to curve themselves towards a collision course with one another, as is the case throughout history. France's simmering discontent with its subordinate position within the German-led Mark Zone will at some point reach a boiling point, and French nationalists, driven by their desire to reclaim their nation's independence, will advocate for something of a Frexit, a dramatic withdrawal from the Mark Zone that will sever the economic ties binding France to German hegemony. It may be a move like this, or perhaps a territorial dispute in Africa, which will inevitably spark a new European war, a war of French independence from Germany's grip. Whether the powder keg in Europe, Africa, or Asia is the first to ignite will remain unanswered, but the inevitability of a clash of powers is certain. But let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm. And subscribe if you really liked hearing about the Mark Zone and the rest of this scenario. You can support us on Patreon by following the link in the description, or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.